it is definitely worth celebrating that Trump is gone. It wasn't inevitable, as you know. It was hard fought. We had to work very hard to ensure it would happen. And it led to horrific scenes that you've seen with an attempted coup of white supremacists attacking the US Capitol. And now we have a new administration and a shift in control of both the House and the Senate in the Congress to the Democratic Party, very narrow control, but nonetheless, Democratic control. What's new is that within the Democratic Party, there is a newly significant divide between the mainstream, centrist, right-wing to some degree, larger faction, the more powerful faction of the party, and a rising progressive faction within the Democratic Party. You all, I'm sure, heard over the last 2 years of the Squad, 4 young, extraordinary women of color who were newly elected to the Congress, who have led much of the progressive work, along with a newly empowered progressive caucus, led by Pramila Jayapal, another extraordinary daughter of immigrants in the Congress. This has been a sea change in many ways. It's a very important shift, partly because the Biden administration themselves are very aware that it was the progressive wing of the party, and most particularly Black women across the country, who are responsible for their victory. And they've had to acknowledge that. They've had to recognize that. And we've seen it. We've seen it in the real shifts in policy that Biden has taken and the people around him have taken since the campaign, most extraordinarily on issues of climate and immigration, but also some shifts around healthcare, around racial justice, and around the economy. And all of that is very, very important. The trickier part and the more dangerous part is that the gap between the two wings of the party, between the centrist wing and the progressive wing, which has been narrower, as I said, on issues of climate and immigration, et cetera, remains very wide on the question of foreign policy. That's where the gap is the widest. And there's a host of reasons for it. Some of it has to do with the Biden history. You know, he sees his own expertise in foreign policy because he was not only 8 years as Obama's vice president, but before that, he had been the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for many years. He, in his view, knows everybody important around the world, which means government officials, heads of state. And all of that is true. He does know his way around the world. He does know all these various people in power. And the other side of it, our movement in the United States, the anti-war peace movements, anti-nuclear movements, all of those movements are simply not as powerful right now as our comrades in the climate movement, the immigrant rights movement, et cetera. So all of those come together around challenging what has become known as not the Washington consensus in the economic sense, that longstanding term, but a consensus of elites in Washington that there is widespread agreement on a number of things, including, most importantly, spending what will be this year $740 billion on the military. It's 53 cents of every federal dollar is spent on the military. And that explains a great deal of the reasons why there are often no answers when people ask, how are we going to pay for a Green New Deal? How are we going to pay for healthcare for all? You know, I'm sure that we don't have a national healthcare system. How are we going to pay for college education? Much of the reason of why we can't pay for those things is because of the money spent on the military. Now, the good news, and there is good news of the Biden administration, is that on his first and second day in office, he issued a number of executive actions that he had said he would do, but most of us thought there would be real questions about which ones he would do. Would it really happen? And indeed, in most cases, it really did happen. He lifted the Muslim ban entirely, which was huge. It was a huge priority of all of our movements. He made massive changes in immigrant rights, particularly including ending all funding for the so-called wall, this giant fence on the US-Mexico border. He reinstated a number of rights for young people who had been brought to the US without documents as children and their rights to remain in the only country they've ever known. This was also a huge movement priority. He canceled the XL pipeline, which was an enormous priority for our movements. he announced the rejoining of the WHO. And contrary to what I was anticipating, he also said that we would join the COVAX vaccine initiative, which I was sure would never happen because it means, to at least a small degree, challenging the power of the big pharmaceutical companies. And yet he said that would happen. Rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. And then crucially, this announcement about the New START treaty, offering to extend it for 5 years, which is precisely what Putin had offered about 2 years ago, I guess it was, when he offered the same deal to extend it for 5 years. It sets the stage for a potential relatively easy agreement between the US and Russia on this extension, avoiding the potential of a large-scale global arms race. So all of that, I think, is very, very important. Now, that's all good for the first few days, the first couple of weeks, the first 100 days. I think we will see a number of very important initiatives that we will support, as we should. These are hard-fought initiatives, which should not be credited to Biden being so far-seeing, but credited to our movements for keeping the pressure on. But then we get to the challenges and the potential dangers. The consensus, as I mentioned, in Washington, that Biden is very much a part of, very much a leader of, says that China should be treated more as a strategic threat than as an economic competitor with whom we have to deal with as other economic competitors, that Russia is a perpetual danger to the United States, that on Israel-Palestine, well, you know, on that one, that the interests of Israel should be primary and that the rights of Palestinians are not even secondary or tertiary, but are so far down on the list as to be almost non-existent. The military budget, of course. And yet, even here, we do see the possibility for some significant changes. On the question of Yemen, I think we might see a rather rapid positive shift towards agreement to end all US involvement, direct involvement at least, in the Yemen war. We know that last year, after a very brief, it was really a 2-year campaign by a number of movement organizations, many of whom had not worked together on specific campaigns before, were able to move from a period where a lot of people in the United States, and I would imagine a lot of people in Congress, couldn't even tell you where is Yemen, what country is Yemen. And after this very quick, sharp campaign focusing on the humanitarian crisis, what the UN has claimed rightfully as being the worst humanitarian crisis underway in the in the world right now, that there was an agreement, and it passed in both houses of the Congress, including in the Republican-led Senate, a resolution to stop direct US engagement in the Saudi-led war. Now, it didn't include the most important aspect, which would be to stop military sales to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. But it did include a number of other ways in which the US was more directly militarily involved, providing intelligence information, et cetera. And it was vetoed by Trump. Biden has indicated that he will not veto if it should come back to his desk. And because the Congress is now led in both houses by Democrats, I'm quite confident that we're going to win on that one. The Progressive Caucus is also proposing a stronger resolution that would include an end to arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I don't know if that one will go through. That's always the hardest thing to challenge in US politics, but I think we have a small chance for that. Then there's the question of Iran, which is another of these critical questions where there is a widespread consensus among elites in Washington that Iran represents a major danger. It's not grounded in anything. If you look at what Iran spends on its military, it's something like $60 billion a year, as opposed to $240 billion that we spend. It does not have nuclear weapons. All 16 US intelligence agencies, as you probably know, have determined, they said it once in 2003, they repeated it in 2007, and they reiterated it in 2016, much to the dismay of the Washington hawks on both parties, made clear that Iran not only doesn't have a nuclear weapon, is not trying to build a nuclear weapon, and in fact has not even made a decision that it wants to have nuclear weapons. That doesn't seem to change the reality of how US looks at Iran and the policy towards it. What we have on our side is that Biden was the vice president to Barack Obama, who recognized that his singular, most important foreign policy success was the Iran nuclear deal. And there's no doubt that Biden wants to go back to it, partly to reclaim it for his own legacy. Now, the problem that we face is that it seems that what Biden and the people around him, including the CIA director, Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor, in their testimony to Congress just in the last few days when they were being confirmed in their positions, all took the position, yes, we want to go back to the Iran nuclear deal, but not until Iran comes into full compliance, and we're a far ways from that. When I heard that, my heart sank, because what that said was they don't recognize that what Iran is dealing with is not just that the US had left the nuclear deal, but that it had faced 3-4 years of crippling, really crippling economic sanctions that impacted the entire population. Children died of malnutrition in Iran, something that had not happened in modern Iranian history. And Iranians know that. So the US owes a great deal to Iran. Just today, I just read it, and right before we went on the air, so I haven't had a chance to assess whether it's accurate or not, but there's a report coming out of Kuwait that Iran has now issued 7 criteria under which it would require before the US could come back into the deal. They're all perfectly reasonable. It has to do with lifting the sanctions that the US reimposed, a whole host of things, and that any negotiations over other issues, the missile issue, other things, have to be after the nuclear deal is back in force and separate from it, which was always the position of both Iran and the US in the old days, but now we don't know how that will go. So it's going to be tricky. It's going to be difficult. And then finally, on the question of Israel-Palestine, one of the issues here is that so much of US policy in the Middle East is shaped by its antagonism to Iran. So the relationship with Israel is partly based on the political support for Israel in the United States, the role of Israel lobbies, et cetera, and the view that Israel's view on Iran must be taken into account. And since Israel claims, or I should say, Netanyahu claims that Iran is an existential threat to Israel, that is always at the starting point of US policy. Now we know that Iran is not an existential threat to Israel. Number one, Israel is the one Middle Eastern country that has a nuclear weapons arsenal, somewhere around 200 high-density nuclear bombs at the Dimona plant. This is something that is not acknowledged officially by the United States, certainly not by Israel, but is widely known around the world. So Iran is not the nuclear danger. Israel, of course, in the region is the nuclear threat. Iran, if it ever chose to create a nuclear weapon and was able to, which it can't and hasn't, it would still at that point only be a threat to Israel's nuclear monopoly, not to its existence. So all of this goes to the difficulties. When we look at what the terrible things were that Biden did around policy towards Israel, recognizing Jerusalem as the sole capital of Israel, recognizing the occupation of the Golan Heights, acknowledging the expansion of settlements and the new Israeli nation state law that essentially legalizes Israeli apartheid as legal parts of Israel and something that the US should be supporting. Biden doesn't support all those things, but he has made clear that he will not, for example, move the embassy out of Jerusalem, where it's in violation of international law, back to Tel Aviv, where virtually all international embassies now are, with a few exceptions that follow the US, that he won't make that move. So even though he may not agree with it, he's not going to make the change that would be required to show that it's no longer part of US policy. So this is going to be a very big challenge for all of us, for the Palestinian rights movement, to keep the issue of rights rather than this notion of we have to go back to a two-state solution when Israel has made a two-state solution impossible. So the question of focusing on rights is going to be very much the centerpiece of our movements. And at the end of the day, and I will finish with this, all of this is going to depend far more on our movements than it does on the wishes of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or anybody around them. There's a famous story in the United States when FDR was looking at how to deal with coming out of the Depression in the midst of war. He was meeting with a lot of progressive forces. He met with one most influential group of all the trade unions, progressive organizations. The Communist Party was involved. They met with him and spent 2 hours outlining all the things that the people of this country needed. And at the end of it, he famously said, okay, I get what you want me to do. Now you go out there and make me do it. That's going to be the necessary component of the lesson that Biden will take from FDR. Not just talking about the 4 freedoms or something like that, but about recognizing the power of movements, and that it's going to be movements that provide him the political capital and that make it impossible for him not to maintain the progressive tone that he has set and the progressive beginning that he has opened his presidency with.